Hey everyone, ready for a deep dive into some seriously mind-bending philosophy?
Always up for a good philosophical challenge.
Awesome. Well, today we're going to be tackling a philosophical heavyweight, uh, René Descartes,
Ah, yes, Descartes.
and his pretty audacious attempt to separate philosophy from theology.
It's a big one for sure.
Yeah, and you might be thinking, wait, isn't that just ancient history?
Yeah, a lot of folks might think that.
But trust me, this separation has had huge implications for how we view knowledge and truth even today.
Absolutely. It's not just some dusty old textbook stuff.
No, not at all. So much more exciting than that.
What's so fascinating about Descartes is that he pops up during this really pivotal period where the traditional view of knowledge, the one dominated by religious dogma, was starting to crack a little.
Interesting.
Yeah, just imagine a world where philosophy and theology were so intertwined that you couldn't really have one without the other.
So, like, every philosophical debate was basically a theological showdown.
Pretty much. Thinkers like Thomas Aquinas, brilliant guy, no doubt.
Oh, yeah. But they were working within this system where faith was the bedrock of reason.
I see.
But then comes the Renaissance, the early modern period, and boom, new scientific discoveries, humanist ideas.
Yeah, it's all changing.
It's like shaking up a snow globe,
Yeah.
Everything's up in the air.
And that's where Descartes steps in, right?
Yeah.
Trying to make sense of this intellectual upheaval.
Exactly. He's basically like, okay, we need some sturdier foundations here.
Uh-huh.
Enough with the shaky ground. I want a system built on reason, on evidence, something that can stand on its own 2 feet, regardless of what any religious text says.
That's a pretty bold statement for his time.
Oh, yeah, totally.
So how does he go about doing this? Does he just chuck out centuries of tradition and start from scratch?
Well, not exactly. He comes up with this radical method,
Oh, okay.
and it's called the method of doubt.
The method of doubt.
Basically, he questions everything, and I mean everything,
Whoa.
to see what, if anything, can withstand this intense scrutiny. He even doubts his own senses. Wow, that's next-level skepticism. So what survives this philosophical pressure cooker?
This is where it gets really interesting. He arrives at his famous cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am.
Ah, yes, I've heard of that one.
Yeah, it's this brilliant realization that even if you doubt absolutely everything else, the very act of doubting proves that you, a thinking being, must exist.
Whoa, okay. So my existential angst actually proves something. I kind of like that.
Yeah.
But how does this one little statement help separate philosophy from theology?
Well, it's a game changer because it establishes a truth that's independent of any religious authority.
Right.
It's basically saying, look, I can know something for certain without relying on faith or scripture.
Okay, so that's one brick in the wall.
Mm-hmm.
What else does Descartes do to build up this independent philosophy?
Well, he turns his attention to the natural world, but with a fresh perspective.
Okay.
Instead of seeing everything as controlled by divine intervention, God's hand in everything,
Mm-hmm.
he starts thinking in terms of natural laws and mechanisms.
So less God made the apple fall and more, what are the forces at play here?
Exactly. He envisions the universe as this incredibly intricate machine governed by predictable laws that we can understand through reason and observation.
So it's almost like he's setting the stage for the scientific revolution, right?
Yeah.
But wait, wasn't Descartes a religious guy himself?
He was very much so.
How does he square this mechanistic worldview with his faith?
That's a really key point. Descartes wasn't trying to kick God out of the picture altogether.
Okay.
He was actually redefining God's role, shifting from a puppeteer, directly controlling everything,
All right.
to more of a guarantor of truth.
So kind of like a cosmic referee, making sure the rules of the universe are being followed.
Exactly. And here's the really interesting part. His arguments for God's existence aren't based on religious texts,
Really?
but on logic and reason. Talk about a bold move.
Wow, that's pretty radical for his time, right?
Yeah.
I mean, trying to prove God's existence through pure logic instead of just relying on faith.
Yeah, it was definitely a departure from the norm.
So I'm starting to see how Descartes is chipping away at that fusion of philosophy and theology.
Mm-hmm.
It's like he's carefully separating them.
Right. He's carving out a space where philosophy can tackle those big questions about knowledge, reality, and existence
Yeah.
without starting from religious assumptions.
It's like philosophy is finally allowed to spread its wings and explore.
Exactly. It's a big step towards intellectual freedom.
But I'm guessing this separation wasn't exactly a smooth ride.
Oh, you better believe it.
What kind of pushback did Descartes get for this?
Oh, both theologians and philosophers had some pretty strong opinions about what he was doing.
Okay, so before we get into all that drama, let's just take a minute to appreciate how revolutionary Descartes' ideas really were.
Absolutely. We're talking about a major shift in thinking that would have a ripple effect on science, secular thought,
Yeah.
and the entire course of philosophy itself.
Truly groundbreaking stuff.
It's hard to overstate his impact. Welcome back to our deep dive into Descartes and his, attempt to redefine the relationship between philosophy and theology.
Yeah, it's been pretty fascinating so far.
Last time we saw how he used that method of doubt
Right.
to try and build a foundation for knowledge based on reason, not religious dogma, which of course led him to his famous, "I think, therefore I am."
Exactly, and we talked about how he kind of saw the universe as this intricate machine governed by these predictable laws.
Yeah.
Almost like he was setting the stage for the scientific revolution.
A real turning point.
But we left off with some serious philosophical drama brewing.
Oh, yeah. Descartes was ruffling some feathers, for sure.
So let's start with the theologians. I can imagine they weren't too keen on philosophy breaking free from its religious roots.
Yeah, you're spot on. For a lot of theologians, it felt like Descartes was kind of demoting divine revelation and religious authority.
I see.
They were worried that if you prioritize reason over faith,
Mm-hmm.
people might start questioning everything you know, and that could lead down a slippery slope towards skepticism and secularism.
Yeah, so it's like if you believe that God is the ultimate source of truth, then allowing reason to judge matters of faith is a pretty scary thought.
Exactly. They saw it as a potential threat to their entire worldview.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about the philosophers? Didn't they applaud Descartes for giving philosophy more autonomy?
Well, it was a mixed bag.
Okay.
Some philosophers, especially those who were into empiricism, observation and experimentation,
Right.
they loved the emphasis on reason and evidence.
I can see why.
But others, even those who liked the idea of separating philosophy from theology, weren't entirely convinced by his approach.
Huh, interesting. So what were their concerns?
Well, their main gripe was with Descartes' reliance on God as a guarantor of truth.
Okay.
They argued that it kind of created this circular reasoning.
How so?
Well, he was using reason to try and prove God's existence,
Right.
but then he was relying on God to validate reason itself.
Yeah, that does sound a bit like a philosophical catch-22.
It definitely got some people scratching their heads.
Yeah. So was his attempt to separate philosophy and theology ultimately successful, or did he just end up creating new problems?
That's the big question, isn't it? And it's one that philosophers have been debating for centuries.
That's a tough one.
It's important to remember that Descartes was a product of his time.
Mm.
He was deeply religious,
Mhm.
and he wasn't trying to get rid of God entirely. He was really trying to find a way for reason to operate independently, but still within a framework where God played a crucial role.
So more of a strategic separation than a complete divorce.
Exactly. He was trying to strike a balance, a way to honor both his faith and his desire for a rational, demonstrable philosophy.
And as you can imagine, that's a pretty tough balancing act.
Oh, yeah, he was walking a tightrope for sure.
So despite all the criticism,
Yeah.
there's no doubt that Descartes' work had a major impact.
Yeah.
We've talked about its influence on science and secular thought.
Mm-hmm.
But what about its legacy within philosophy itself?
Oh, it's huge. By emphasizing reason and doubt, Descartes essentially laid the groundwork for modern epistemology.
Epistemology.
Yeah, the study of knowledge.
Oh, okay. So instead of just accepting things on faith or tradition, he shifted the focus to how we know what we know.
Right. He forced philosophers to really grapple with that fundamental question. How can we be certain of anything?
That's a good question.
And this led to a more critical and analytical approach to philosophical inquiry.
It's like he raised the bar for philosophical rigor, demanding more evidence and logical justification.
Absolutely. And his influence didn't stop there. His focus on the mind and how it shapes our perception of reality,
Yeah.
that also had a huge impact on the development of psychology and cognitive science.
His ideas had these real-world consequences, reaching beyond just, the walls of academia.
Oh, for sure.
And into the way we understand ourselves and the world around us.
Exactly. Descartes' work wasn't just some abstract thought experiment.
Right.
It was a real turning point in Western thought, influencing how we think about knowledge, reason, and even the human mind.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've explored his motivations, his method, the impact of his work, the criticisms he faced.
Yeah, it's been quite a journey.
But before we wrap things up, I'm curious, how does his attempt to separate philosophy and theology resonate with us today? We live in this world that's constantly bombarded with information.
Right.
where science and technology are advancing at an incredible pace.
It's changing so fast.
And where different belief systems are constantly interacting and sometimes clashing. How does Descartes fit into all of this?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's one we'll tackle in the final part of our deep dive.
All right, so we're back for the final part of our deep dive into René Descartes.
It's been a wild ride.
Yeah, it has been pretty mind-bending.
Lots to think about, for sure.
Definitely. And, we've covered his quest for this reason-based truth.
Right, starting with that doubt.
Yeah, and his famous, "I think, therefore I am" statement.
Such a classic.
Yeah, and even his attempt to kind of redefine God's role as the ultimate guarantor of knowledge.
It was a bold move.
Definitely. But before we wrap up, I'm really curious. How does all of this, how does Descartes' work speak to us today?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it?
It is. I mean, here we are centuries later in a world that's just constantly bombarded with information.
Information overload.
It is,
Yeah.
right. And technology is changing faster than most of us can keep up with.
It's hard to keep up, for sure.
Yeah, and, we've got all these different belief systems constantly interacting and sometimes clashing.
Yeah, creating all sorts of tension.
So, where does Descartes fit into all of this?
It's amazing, isn't it, how even after all this time, the questions Descartes was grappling with are still so relevant.
Yeah.
I mean, we're still wrestling with that fundamental tension between what we believe and what reason and evidence tell us.
It's like that classic debate, right? Science versus religion, logic versus faith.
Yeah, that old chestnut.
Can they coexist peacefully? Or are they destined to be at odds?
Well, I think Descartes offers some interesting insights into this dilemma. He showed us that it's not necessarily about choosing sides, about being either a devout believer or a hard-nosed skeptic.
You don't have to pick just one.
No, not at all. It's more about recognizing that faith and reason can operate in different domains, addressing different aspects of the human experience.
So it's not about throwing out faith altogether, but approaching it with a critical and inquisitive mind.
Exactly. I mean, Descartes himself was a devout Christian, but he also believed that reason should have its own space to explore and investigate, free from the constraints of dogma.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
I guess faith can provide meaning, purpose, a sense of belonging.
Absolutely.
And then reason can help us understand the world, make informed decisions, solve problems.
They each have their own strength.
Right. And we kind of need both to navigate the complexities of life.
I think so.
But finding that balance, that's not always easy, is it?
A lifelong challenge, for sure.
Yeah, we still struggle with these big questions, about the limits of scientific knowledge.
Yeah.
The role of faith in a secular society, and how different belief systems can actually coexist peacefully.
It's a constant juggling act.
It really is. But I think Descartes' legacy reminds us that this effort is essential.
It's crucial.
Yeah, he really encourages us to embrace critical thinking, to question assumptions, and to seek evidence, even for the things we hold dear.
To really examine our beliefs.
Right. So it's about being intellectually honest with ourselves.
Yeah.
Recognizing that faith and reason can actually complement each other.
They can work together.
Yeah, and finding a balance that works for each of us individually.
Finding your own path.
Exactly. Well, on that note, I think Descartes would be pretty proud of us for having this conversation, don't you?
I think so.
It's amazing how his ideas sparked centuries ago are still so relevant to our lives today.
Yeah, his work really stands the test of time.
It does. So, as we wrap up our deep dive into Descartes, I'll leave you with this final thought.
Well,
how do you navigate this complex relationship between faith and reason in your own life?
it's a question worth pondering.
Yeah. Thanks for joining us on this intellectual adventure. We'll see you next time.